it's this magical idea that you could just like take a pill and like magically just not get pregnant and everything else in your body is the same. Like that's a lie. When we look at our menstrual cycle as a vital sign, to go back to this point, then we can't look at it as separate. So I always give these silly analogies and like, so, you know, if I wanted to buy it, like it would be a dumb idea, but if I wanted to buy a car with no air conditioning, like that would be stupid. But if I did, I could, and the engine would still work and it would make no difference because it is a machine, right? But like with our bodies, we've kind of been sold this idea that you can just shut down your ability to get pregnant with this magical little pill and like it has no other effects. But if you just look at the side effect profile, then you have to ask yourself, like, if it really didn't have anything to do with it, why would the primary effect be depression and the libido? Like obviously it has all this and like when you get into the weeds with some of the other effects, like the increased risk of gallstones and like there's associations and correlations with immune disorders and even a higher risk of like IBS if you're susceptible to like Crohn, like it's just unreal. So then from that perspective, we shouldn't be that surprised that there is this relationship between the pill and how we relate to other people. Like it's kind of messing with our natural pickers. And that's terrifying. Like it's really terrifying.
Welcome back to the podcast this week, you guys. Today's reviewer of the week is eReese307, and she says, game changer for a first birth. This podcast was my best resource during pregnancy. I just had my first baby, and before the birth, I listened to every episode of the podcast, which always blows my mind, you guys. There's a lot of them out there, so good job. She says, my birth preferences went out the door when my babe was diagnosed with fetal growth restriction, and I was scheduled to be induced early. This podcast gave me the strength and knowledge to stay positive and continue forward to have the most amazing natural-ish hospital birth. Now I have a beautiful baby girl who is as healthy as can be at 1 week old. Thank you. Thank you for your review. And you guys, if you haven't left one yet, go ahead and do that now. But let's get started with today's episode. So today I have with me Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, who is a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner who trains women's health practitioners to use their menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices. She is the founder of the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program. She's the author of 3 best-selling books, The Fifth Vital Sign, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook, and her most recent book, Real Food for Fertility, which she co-authored with Lily Nichols, RDN. Lisa works tirelessly to debunk the myth that regular ovulation is only important when you want children by recognizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. And drawing heavily from the current scientific literature, Lisa presents an evidence-based approach to help women connect to their 5th vital sign by uncovering the connection between the menstrual cycle, fertility, and overall health. With well over 4 million downloads, her podcast, Fertility Friday, is the #1 source for information about fertility awareness and menstrual cycle health. So with me today is Lisa. So Lisa, thank you so much for being here. Do you want to take a moment and maybe talk about your family or anything that I skipped there, but just go ahead and say hello and introduce yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I mean, it's so interesting as you get older how like the bio just gets like longer and longer.
So true.
But a little fun fact about myself for those who have never, been interacting with my work. I do have 3 children. So I'm married and my eldest is 12. So at this time I have a 12-year-old, 9-year-old, and a 2-year-old. It was like during COVID, like my husband and I, because I do these classes, right? And in the classes with fertility awareness, you kind of do this intention scale exercise, right? So whenever I do the intention scale exercise in class, it's like, on a scale of 0 to 10, how ready are you to have a baby right now? So I would then ask my husband, well, where are you at? And for years, he was at a 2, like a solid 2. And I was at like a 4 because I wanted a 3rd baby. So in the middle of COVID, I asked him this question. He's like, 8. And I'm like, one moment. And now we have a 2-year-old as well.
Oh, congratulations. That's awesome. I love it. Do you like having the older kids too? Are they like pretty helpful and loving on the little 2-year-old?
Yeah, it's really fun. It's so interesting because you would think logically that the older ones would interact kind of differently, but I feel like siblings are siblings regardless of the age. So like you would think like the 12-year-old and the 2-year-old would have nothing to fight about, but you would be wrong. But
I
it's so
love
much
that.
fun.
Siblings are siblings at every turn. I love it. All right. Well, let's dive into today's episode. I know we have a lot to cover. I had Lily Nichols on. I've had her on a couple of times in my podcast here. And the last thing we talked about was the book that you guys co-authored together. And it's excellent. I've been through it and I feel like everybody should read it. I don't care if you have fertility, quote unquote, issues or not. This stuff is really important and it's super interesting as well. At least it's the kind of stuff that I eat up. So I do want to dive into some of that information today. And then we had some people who reached out to us and had some questions of their own. So we want to hit on some of those as well. But to start things off, you refer to the menstrual cycle as the fifth vital sign. So will you kind of talk about that for a moment and tell us what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about the vital signs that we're most familiar with, we think about things like our blood pressure or our heart rate or our respiratory rate, how many breaths we take each minute. And we all have a general understanding that if you were to go to your primary care provider and they were to test your vitals, that there is a normal range. And beyond that, if you're testing higher than that normal range or lower than that normal range, each situation would give the doctor some information as to where to look next. So that's the interesting thing about the vital signs. And so when you think of the menstrual cycle as the fifth vital sign, I'm not just talking about the period. I know sometimes when I say menstrual cycle, people will think, oh, it's just the period. But I'm talking about that period of time from, the first day of your menstrual period to the last day before the next one. And if we break down the menstrual cycle into its various parts, there's a variety of different stages and a variety of different things that we can pay attention to. So we could pay attention to the period, the quality of it, the length of it, the volume, whether it's painful. We could look at your cervical mucus, which is a natural excretion that we produce as we approach ovulation that helps to keep the sperm alive and plays a really key role in fertility. So we could look at just that aspect of it and when that's happening in the cycle. We could look at the overall length. We could look at the length of your luteal phase. We could look at if you have any abnormal bleeding that's happening. And when we break down your cycle that way, similarly to the other vital signs, where if it's out of the ordinary, it would give us some information. We can glean information about all of these different aspects. And it can be something as simple as you have abnormal cervical mucus and you're seeing some sort of discharge all the time, which could indicate an infection, to something more serious, where if you're of reproductive age and you haven't had a period for, 6 months or a year, that is associated with a greater increase of osteoporosis in your lifetime. So there's a lot of implications there. And I'm quite confident that we should be looking at our menstrual cycle beyond just its ability to give us children, because there's so much more we can learn about it when we actually pay attention.
Yeah, I agree with you. And with that, can I ask you, what does a normal menstrual cycle look like? What should it look like?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I started kind of alluding to it there, but we start from the beginning. We can start with the period. I would say that even just alluding to this idea that pain is just totally normal, pain is very common. A lot of women do have pain with menstruation, but I would say that anything beyond moderate pain, anything beyond that mild to moderate, we should be paying attention to, because when we're looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, when we look at the period in particular, the period is a normal inflammatory process by which we shed our uterine lining. And when that process is happening normally, you're not really having a lot of pain. When they look at women who are actually having high levels of pain, they find that the prostaglandin levels, which is an inflammatory marker, are up to 4 times or more higher. So even just from that standpoint, so to start off the conversation, we could look at the period and say, we would expect a healthy cycle to have, mild pain, and anything beyond that, we should just be looking at. Doesn't mean that there's a huge, huge problem right off the bat, because it's very common to have pain, but we shouldn't be thinking that it's just normal. And the period itself, anywhere from, 4 to 5 days is about average. And I always say the period should be like a sentence. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it should be over. So if we're having lots of bleeding leading up to the period, lots of days of spotting before you actually start to have your flow, or, several days afterwards, or if you are having bleeding all throughout the cycle, those are all things that fall outside of the normal range. And then once your period ends, we are into our preovulatory phase. So when we look at the overall cycle, a healthy cycle for a reproductive age woman should fall somewhere between about 24 to 35 days in length. And in order for it to be that long, ovulation would have to happen somewhere between approximately days 10 and days 22. So even that gives you a bit of a guideline, and it already starts to push at the myth that all the cycles are always 28 days and ovulation is always taking place on day 14, because that's not actually the case when you look at real human women. And so in that pre-ovulatory phase, as we're leading up to ovulation, that's the time when our ovaries are really developing. The follicles are starting to grow in preparation for our ovulation. They're producing estrogen at that time, and that estrogen triggers our cervical mucus production. So I already alluded to cervical mucus, and cervical mucus is a natural, like I said, excretion that's produced as we approach ovulation. It's what keeps the sperm alive. And so we would expect to see anywhere from about 2 to 7 days of this cervical fluid. And it can look like creamy white hand lotion. It can look like that kind of raw egg white and stretchy. And when you're going to the bathroom during that phase, you might find that you're wiping and it's really slippery. Or you might just have found that there's times of your cycle when you are just wet. Like I can remember when I was a teenager, I had no idea this information, but I knew that all of a sudden there was these days when my underwear would be wet. And I remember I asked my mom about it, and she was just like, "Oh, wear a panty liner." Because she didn't really know either.
Right.
That was the extent of it. But now knowing this information, it's so helpful to know that. So once you then ovulate, once the egg is released, you start to produce a significant amount of progesterone. And progesterone has this effect of shutting down the cervical mucus production. It kind of counters the effects of estrogen. So once you ovulate, you would expect your mucus to largely go away. And that second half of your cycle in a healthy cycle is about 12 to 14 days. And so that's important, because if you are trying to get pregnant and that second half of your cycle is only 7 days long, when you learn about the process of implantation, for example, when you ovulate, if you're trying to conceive and you're successful, the sperm would already be in the fallopian tubes waiting for the egg even before it's released. So they're actually already waiting and hanging out there. It's a really interesting design. The mucus is produced before, and then if you have sex when you have the mucus, and it keeps the sperm alive, and they're just kind of hanging out, having a party and waiting for the egg, and then she comes, and then love at first sight. I know, it's super cheesy. But then once the implantation happens in the tube, it takes about a week or so for the fertilized egg to kind of make its way into the endometrial lining. And then the process of implantation takes about another week. So as you can see, or just imagine, if you were starting to have your period already a week after ovulation, then that would potentially really hinder that implantation to take place. So the healthy luteal phase length, about 12 to 14 days from your ovulation day, and then you would have your next period. Now, what's interesting about all the things I just said is that for women who haven't necessarily encountered fertility awareness or this concept of body literacy, that might be the first time they've ever heard someone break it down in such depth. Beyond just like, it should be 28 days or whatever. And when we get into it, when we get into the weeds, as of course, that's my whole career, getting into the weeds about this stuff, we really start to see why, oh my goodness, like when we say the menstrual cycle is like a vital sign, like we can really get into that and learn from it. Because when we start to understand that your cycles are a reflection of what's happening health-wise, there is a such thing as normal. We have all of these parameters, not just one, all of these parameters within that to look at. Then we can really start to appreciate that, if the cycle's out of alignment, it's not just randomly happening for no reason. And we can start to kind of dig deeper to find out why that's happening and what we can do about it.
Yeah. So can I ask, is that what your course kind of goes into?
Yeah. So I've been doing this work for quite a while. So when I first started, I was teaching women to chart their cycles on an individual, and group basis. So, after many, many years of doing that, what started to happen is women's health professionals are reaching out to me. I want to do this too with my clients. I want to help them in the same ways, because in the work that I'm doing, it goes beyond, like we, of course, teach charting as a foundation, but that's kind of the beginning of the story. Because once you can track your cycle in a really specialized way, then you can start to identify different things that are going awry. And when you're working with women and they're coming to you for charting, what happens is they're really coming to you because they have cycle issues that they want to understand. So, as a new fertility awareness educator, when I started working in the field, you just think, they're just going to want to learn to chart their cycles. They're just going to want to use this for birth control. But you find that they're really wanting to find out what's going on with their cycles. So after many years of doing that and working with women to not only identify what was going on, but also develop, different protocols and strategies to support the menstrual cycle, to restore it, to a more optional functioning to keep it into that optimal range. That is really what we teach our practitioners in our mentorship program. So it's a really interesting and unique program because the word mentorship is there for a reason. And I actually, before our call today, I was interviewing a couple of our practitioners for my podcast. And one of them was saying, she's like, I didn't actually expect that I would be charting my own cycles and I would be going through this process that I'm taking my clients through. But that's a huge part of the program because ultimately, if you enter this field with kind of like this idea that I just know it all and I'm just going to tell everybody what to do, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to relate to your clients. When you're looking at making changes, dietary changes, making lifestyle changes, really looking at the connection between those things in your cycle, it's really helpful to have that kind of lived experience of having done that yourself and knowing how difficult it is, knowing how challenging it can be to really help you to relate better to your clients.
Yeah, I think you said a lot of really important things that, just compacted a ton of like things that we could just expand on in all directions. But I think one of them had to do with just, it is not normal right now for women to understand their cycles. And it's also like you teaching practitioners. I think that's so important to let's repeat that again for everybody listening, because our practitioners that we go to see, even for fertility and even for our pregnancies and births, don't necessarily have the kind of training that you are offering right now. And it digs so much deeper into stuff that we don't understand naturally. But once you do, it kind of starts making sense. And so I'm grateful for you and what you do and that there are people like you so that we can help women really understand what's going on with themselves and kind of get back to that base of how do we make it the healthiest, which is why I love that you paired with Nilly too, because it's nutrition is part of it. You talked about lifestyle. I'm sure that there's a lot more that goes into it, but it's so important. So thank you for that. Thank you for everything that you do. I just think it's so crucial right now.
I really appreciate you saying that. I just wanted to say that because it's a very unique field. One of the questions I get is like, how did you get into this? I was very fortunate to, when I was going to university, there was actually a group of women who were offering monthly charting classes. And it was like a 9-month session, very birthy, very on brand, right? And the ultimately where I received my initial certification as a fertility awareness educator, they had a physical location at that time and they were located in the same city that I went to school with. So I was really fortunate to be mentored by women who had already a lot of years of experience, many years of doing this. And from very early on, that really cemented this idea that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign because you were able to see, you come and maybe you're having some issues with your cycle. Maybe you're having some spotting before your period, or maybe you're having a short luteal phase like we talked about or something like that. And then you learn that, if you improve your nutrition, if you look at some of those lifestyle factors, that it can improve. And then you actually see it change in real time. It has a really profound effect. And so to your point, a lot of this feels like something that should be intuitive. So when we learn about it, it feels like we should already know the information. But from that professional standpoint of, working on a professional level with clients, there is a lot more to it because a lot more nuance. Because what happens is that you think, oh, I know how to chart my cycles. This is easy. But then you start working with people and you just see stuff that you just didn't even, like the things that you see in real women's cycles are just, they're not like what you have. Because there's just such a wide variety of different experiences that women have with this.
Well, and I think that's important too. Something that you said, a normal cycle can be anywhere between 24 and I think you said 35 days. Is that correct? And I think that's important because even, when I'm talking to women about birth and pregnancy and stuff, it's like a normal time, like they always say 40 weeks, that's your due date. And it's based off of this 28-day cycle. And not all women ovulate the same and not all women have the same amount of cycle days. And so I definitely have talked to people about make sure if you can to understand at least when you ovulate, because then you can at least come to your provider when we're talking about due dates and stuff with that information. But it's all kind of like one and the same. And we're not all made the same, but you were talking about, but there are markers to tell you if you're on the right track and if your cycle is in order, even if you're a 24-day cycler or a 35-day cycler. And so I think that's important for women to understand that we're not all meant to be exactly the same, but there are things that show the health and vitality of it. So anyways, I just feel like there's so much that we can go into off of like just the beginning of that episode. So yeah, it's just such solid information. So thank you. Okay, something that I know we got questions about and comes up a lot. And you did talk about it in your book as well. And so I want to hit on that. Can we take a minute and talk about birth control? Because this is a huge thing for moms right now, right? Like, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a very high percent of women that are on birth control or have been on it at one time. And that's starting in their teenage years. And we're also seeing, and I'm not just correlating just these two things, but we're also seeing a lot more women having trouble getting pregnant, and particularly coming off of birth control and then trying to get pregnant. So can you talk a little bit about birth control and your thoughts on that, and what women should do with it if they're trying to get pregnant?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much that can be said about birth control. I could talk about birth control for hours. But to your point, I think it is really important to have a nuanced conversation about it. And I think for me, the best way that I've done that in my writings and when I'm asked about it is by looking at what the research has to say. Because the birth control pill and other hormonal, applications of it, there's a lot of issues there. And so it can be really easy to think that there's this direct correlation between birth control and fertility issues. And so, after looking at a ton of research in this area, what the research, we could talk about side effects. That's a separate conversation. We could talk about, how the pills associate with increased risk of anxiety, depression, mood changes, and nutrient deficiencies. And there's a variety of issues related to just side effects. But we're looking at fertility in particular. The research doesn't seem to indicate that there is a kind of long-lasting effect on fertility whatsoever. And so, but it's interesting when you look at how the studies are done. So I would say most of the birth control studies, they take women who've been on the pill for, it depends. You have to look at how long, because they might have a short-term study with women on the pill for 3 months. And how useful is that when women are using the pill for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20, 30. I had a client who was on the pill for 30 years. So obviously, so you look at that part of it. But what in general, whether they're doing like a normal 2-year range or whatever they're doing, when they look at women coming off the pill, they typically have these studies where they will take all these women who came off the pill and they will look at what percentage conceive within a year. Now, one thing I always have to say is that when they are choosing participants for these studies, anybody who had pre-existing menstrual issues is not included. So in these studies, you can read them yourself. We cite enough of them in the books, but when you read these studies, if you did have a woman who had irregular cycles and that's why she was put on the pill, or she didn't have a cycle and that's why she was put on the pill, those types of scenarios are excluded from the study. So basically, and we know a lot of women are put on the pill for period issues. So when we're looking at the results of these studies, we have to take into consideration that they might not represent you if you were put on the pill for those types of issues. But be that as it may, they look at these studies and they'll say, okay, well, 80% of these women, conceived within a year. So it's more rare to find a study that actually breaks this down month to month. So in Real Food for Fertility and also in the Fifth Vital Sign, I shared a study that actually did break this down month by month. And I think this is relevant for women who are coming off the pill and trying to conceive because it really drives the point home. If you look at the study that says 80% of women conceive, that makes it seem like it doesn't matter. There's no difference. But again, the first point that I made was that they're not taking into consideration women who had any kind of issue prior. And then the second thing is that they're just looking at the end of the 12 months. So, in the study that broke it down, they had a variety of different birth control methods. So they had, women who just used condoms, so non-hormonal. They had women who were using the combined pill, women who were using the shot, women who were using the IUD. So they compared a variety of different birth control methods. What they found was that, the women who just use condoms on average would conceive in an average of four months after coming off. So of course, average means some conceive sooner and some conceive later. The women who came off the pill, it took about twice as long. And in that study, they defined long-term use as 2 years or more. So, for users, 2 years or more, which is long-term, on average, it took twice as long. So instead of the average 4 months, it took average 8 months. So again, that means some got conceived earlier and some conceived later, but that's pretty significant, right? And then the shot was the worst. I'm no fan of the shot. It's my least favorite type of hormonal contraception. 18 months though was the average for that. And then the IUD was, the hormonal IUD was somewhere around there as well, like the 8 month mark. So the reason I share that is because from the researcher's standpoint, when they're looking at it from the end of 12 months, they're just saying, well, there's not much of a difference. But from the average woman who has been told her whole life that she could get pregnant on any day, who's never been educated about her body, who's actually been terrified of getting pregnant the whole time she was on the pill. That's why she was on it. And, I've had conversations with so many women who were trying to be proactive. It's like, oh, I'm getting married in the fall. I've been on the pill for 5 years. Should I come off? So I always say it like this too. Like they like put on their clothes, they made an appointment. So they called the doctor's office. They made an appointment. They take a shower. They put on their clothes. They like drive across town to go to the doctor for the doctor to tell them, no, it's fine. Don't come off the pill early. You'll just get pregnant right away. But I always say, like, there was something inside of you that was concerned enough that you went through all those steps for this person to tell you it doesn't make a difference. Like for that woman, when she comes off the pill, she's expecting to get pregnant immediately. And so when it doesn't happen in that first month, she might be okay the first month, but by month 2, she's already on alert. And by month 6, she's probably already at a fertility specialist. And I'm speaking to women who've probably literally done this, who are listening right now. So the reason that I highlight that is because, what the research would indicate is that there's a temporary period of subfertility associated with contraceptive use, especially if you've used it long-term, as they define it in the literature, which is 2 years or more, which many of us have used it. It does not mean that you're going to come off the pill and you won't be able to get pregnant. It doesn't mean that you couldn't get pregnant while you're still on the pill. I have friends who got pregnant on the pill because of, the failure rate or whatever. Maybe they took antibiotics that month or something. But that's not the point. The point was that the average was longer and no one prepares you for that. And there's no plan or strategy around it. Even though we know that the pill depletes significant, there's a lot of nutrient deficiencies. The scary research that we share about the pill is related to ovarian shrinkage and the lowering of the temporary lowering of our ovarian reserve parameters when you're actually on the pill taking it. And I use the word pill to refer to the combined hormones. There's a variety of different, but when you're on those hormones and if you were to be on it right now and you tested your AMH or you tested your ovarian volume or something like that, it's well known that when you're on it, it's lower. Because what happens when you're on the pill is that it suppresses ovulation. And so many years of suppressing ovulation, it would, the scary, one of the scariest stats that I share in the book is the stat that women who are on the pill, their ovarian volume is about 50% less, meaning like your ovaries are smaller. And the research would indicate that after about, 6-7 months, that starts to resolve and starts to resume back to normal. There was a study where I got that data from, was a fertility preservation study. And so I always say that when you're trying to get this information, you have to go where the money is, because who's doing the research, right? Research isn't free. And so the fertility preservation studies, those are women who are coming in their, 20s and 30s, dropping tens of thousands of dollars to freeze their eggs. And so what they were finding is that if women are coming, like they're on the pill and then they immediately go to do that, they're not getting as many eggs. So the study, they compared the kind of the egg retrieval success for the first, 1 month out, 2 months out. And they found that after about 7 months, after coming off the pill, they had a better collection of eggs for this process. So their recommendation to the women was like, okay, well, if you're coming in to get your eggs retrieved and frozen, then we should, you should consider coming off the pill for at least 6 months or so leading up to it. But when in the history of the world has any woman who's been trying to conceive naturally ever been told that information? Right? As if it's like a totally different thing, as if there would be no. So I'm going to get off like I told you, I could talk about this all day, but if there's one takeaway here, it's just that, the research doesn't indicate that there's this permanent negative effect, but the research does indicate that there is a temporary period of subfertility. And so my recommendation, and like Lily and our recommendation in Real Food for Fertility, is to really consider, your plans. Like when I got married, my husband and I, we took a year or two to plan our wedding, but we're not provided the information of how to plan for having babies. So, and even when you go to your doctor and ask them about the pill and how it could relate to fertility, they're not telling you this information, right? So if you were put on the pill, not for medical reasons, not because you had an issue with your cycle, and not like the year after you started your first period. So if you actually, went through puberty and you had your period for a few years and it was like pretty normal, and then you were on the pill like for birth control, then in that case, I would say if it's possible, I mean, I always go for the longer suggestion, but I would say if it's possible, try to aim for like coming off a year before, at least a year before you're wanting to start trying. And during that time, you're coming off before you're ready to get pregnant. So I'm suggesting to come off when you're actually still afraid of getting pregnant, and having that conversation with your partner and really thinking about, okay, what are my non-hormonal birth control alternatives? And I suggest that so that you can allow your cycle to normalize. Now, if you're not in that category, if you did go on the pill because you had irregular cycles, or because you didn't know when your next period was coming, or because you weren't getting a period at all, then you're in a different risk category. And I would say at least 18 months to 2 years, if possible. Now, it's always hard having these conversations because, not everybody has that amount of time. But someone needs to tell you the other side of that story, because I think as you get older, like most of us can think of someone who did get off the pill and got pregnant right away. But we can also think about someone who came off the pill and it took them a while. And you just don't know which one you're going to be. It's like buying insurance. Like, I don't expect to get into a car accident, but I have insurance. So like, you don't expect that it's going to take you a long time to conceive, but you probably should come off the pill sooner than you think.
Yeah. I think you said so much. I think it is a disservice to women that we don't tell them these things. And like you had said, going to your provider and, here we are teaching women, ask the benefits, ask the risks. And you can ask it and you're not going to get the information that you just provided. So I think that's why this conversation is so important, because I don't even know if those providers know those risks, because they certainly don't tell you about them. The most I've heard is like blood clots, be careful, don't smoke, right? So and when that's all the information you're getting, and then you go to get pregnant with all your wildest dreams and your honey, it's like, oh, well, that it can be a crushing blow. It's really hard. And like you said, you end up in these fertility places. And then frustrating to hear that the fertility clinics figured it out. They're able to see these things, but again, it's not making its way back to the other direction. So, and then too, I think just any time that we mess with Mother Nature, and our bodies are incredible, to hear that like 6 or 7 months later, it starts functioning properly again after we've beat it up for 10 years or whatever the case, I think that's pretty incredible. But we have to understand that anytime we get in the way of Mother Nature and trying to do our own things, whether it's science or our own experiments, that there are effects to that. And so I think you talking about this is really important. Okay, you did mention, so you mentioned the word fertility awareness. Can I have you define that real quick? Because we've talked about all kinds of things, but I'm just curious, like what you have that mean.
Mm-hmm. I feel like there's a general way to talk about fertility awareness, and then like a more specific like fertility awareness method part of the conversation. So I would say in a general sense, fertility awareness just alludes to you having an understanding of your cycle. And when I say understanding of your cycle, I would mean that you know how to identify your fertile days, you know how to identify when you're ovulating. And with that knowledge, you can even learn how to predict when your period is coming. So I know, as a teenager, that's one of the biggest issues. That's why some women go on the pill, because they just don't want to be surprised by the bleeding, right? Because it can be just so, when I was younger, I used to read the YM magazine. I don't know what's popular now, but like they always had, I forget what it was called, but there was like the one section of like the funny things or the embarrassing things that would happen, but it was all periods. Everything was like, oh, I didn't have a tampon and no. So this is like a big thing, but fertility awareness at the most basic level is understanding those aspects of your body. And unfortunately, this is not like standard what we're taught in school, because we're just taught nothing. We're just taught, I was taught, oh, you can get pregnant every day. And I was a child in the 90s. So I was also taught that if you have sex, you'll get AIDS and die. That was it.
Right.
That's the whole class. Thank you for coming. Yeah. So fertility awareness takes it deeper. And then if you, even just in the general sense of like, oh, I can tell when I'm ovulating and I know what that mucus discharge means. Like, oh my goodness, I don't think I have a yeast infection every month, which is a thing. There are women who don't know about their mucus and they go to the doctor, and sometimes the doctor doesn't do a swab, and then the woman ends up on antibiotics because she's literally just having her mucus. That is just a perfectly normal and healthy part of being a woman. So there's that. And then if we take it to the deeper level, that's when you can choose what you're going to do with that information. So, I don't think that every single woman has to use fertility awareness as their primary birth control method, because we couldn't even, like if we all got together, all of us who are we doing the episode and everyone's listening, we couldn't even choose a place for dinner. So we're not all going to complain or all going to agree on one birth control that's best for everyone. Right. But my whole thing is that, with fertility awareness, when you learn about your cycle, you learn that there is only a small window of time when pregnancy is scientifically, biologically possible. So it can be a bit of a mind warp because we've all been told that you can just get pregnant all the time and you just live in this state of terror. But then when you actually learn how your body works and you learn science about it, then you learn that there's a window. And so that information is really interesting because then you could actually use it as a birth control. There's evidence on it. There's plenty of research. And when you're using the symptothermal method, and so in our, FAM program, we teach the symptothermal method. And that means that we're tracking that mucus that we talked about. We're tracking temperature. You can track the changes in your cervical position as an optional sign. And we even teach our practitioners a last infertile day calculation, which increases the efficacy. So when you look at the studies that show the highest efficacy of this method, the top efficacy symptothermal methods are right up there with hormonal birth control, with like the 99.4% perfect use. And then typical use is obviously a bit lower than that when you have someone who actually knows what they're doing and took the time to learn it and that kind of thing. And for many women, now, like I said, this isn't for everybody, I get it. But for many women who didn't have a good experience on birth control, they say about 50% of women who come on, the birth control pill of the day will come off of it at the end of the year, maybe switch to a different one because of the side effects. So again, half of them are happy, but the other half are not. So a lot of women aren't happy. And I've just spoken to so many women over the years. There's just some women it just doesn't agree with. There's some women who they took this kind and they didn't, they had the mood swings or they felt depressed or they lost their sex drive or whatever. And then they went on a next one. And then they didn't like that one either. Went on a next one. Then they tried the IUD. Then they tried the implant. And then they went on the pill again. And they got to the point where they felt crazy because they didn't feel good on this thing. They tried them all. They're still not feeling good. And they feel like there's no option. And so the thing about fertility awareness in this capacity is I think that it would be, of course, I think that because this is what I do for a living, but I think it would be a better world if every woman knew about fertility awareness just as a concept. Just they understood how their body worked. They understand they weren't fertile every day. They understood what their cervical mucus meant. They understood how to confirm ovulation. They understood the normal parameters of the cycle that we went through. I think the world would just be better if we all knew that. And then you would know that you have the option of a non-hormonal method that's effective if you wanted it, if you needed it.
So I love that too, because you're talking about using it. So we use it to conceive, but we can also use it to keep from conceiving, understanding our cycle.
And I got all in the birth control track because we're talking about the pill. But absolutely, when you're wanting to get pregnant,
then
it's amazing because then you just, and this is something, so I'll just touch on that a little bit. So thank you for pointing out, because of course I'm in I'm in my pill, once you get me started, right? But one of the great, because, I'm the kind of, if you want to call it a feminist, but I'm the kind of feminist that believes that we should be able to have babies when we want to, as well as delay that until we are ready. So I think that the true meaning of this kind of freedom of being a woman isn't just to avoid, but to be able to choose to have babies when we want and to be able to prepare our bodies. This was when Lily and I got together to write Real Food for Fertility. I mean, that's the vision, to equip men and women to be able to prepare their bodies so that when they're ready to get pregnant, in an ideal world, you'd have this time to prepare. And then when you're ready, you would actually conceive easily. That's the goal, right? So when you understand how your body works, many women discover fertility awareness because they thought that they could get pregnant every day of the cycle. So they just have lots of sex and that pregnancy doesn't happen. And so then they're kind of like, wait a minute, this is not what they taught me in school. I should have been pregnant like last week when he looked at me, right? But I'm not. And so that's when a lot of women find, oh, wait, there's actually like fertile days, wait, the ovulation, what? And then they kind of start into this knowledge of like, wow, there's timing. So we can take that a lot deeper. It is essential to know the correct timing because timing is not the only factor. But without correct timing, you have nothing. Because as I already mentioned, you can use this as a birth control method. So if you never hit your window, you are inadvertently using the method for birth control. You didn't know it. But when you go a little bit deeper and you discover that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign and it's reflecting your overall health, then you can start to see like, oh my goodness, I'm not conceiving, but I'm also noticing this issue with my cycle or that issue with my cycle that I didn't know before. Maybe I should be looking at improving that. Or on the flip side, you dig into your cycle and you're like, wait a minute, my cycle is great. And then you look at your partner because he's 50% of the equation.
Yes, which I feel like I would love to hit that on another episode because you were talking, there's like sperm counts and checking on the health of your husband and or birth partner and all of that. And that part's super interesting too, or even improving your egg quality, improving his sperm quality. There's a lot on that side that we could definitely dive into. I think something that you brought up though, like this whole episode, and I'm just like, first of all, women are incredible. But secondly, like it's on us. This has always been my soapbox, right? Like informed consent is a big one for me. You have to have the information to understand what you're consenting to. And that includes like what we're learning for ourselves and consenting to with our own lives. So when you're talking about, fertility awareness or using our cycles to be able to start or stop pregnancy, I feel like without putting the blame on women, it gives the women power. Like it gives us all the power to understand our cycles and to be able to have those conversations with other women who understand how to do this correctly or how we can understand what's happening in our bodies. So again, I mean, providers are great, but their scope is small. And so just like a plug for charting as well, because this is something that I ended up doing when I was having issues with my cycles and we were trying to get pregnant, but it was really cool and it was really fun. And once you get started, you're like, oh my gosh, like I totally know which part of my cycle I'm at. And then Lily on the other end, the nutrition side of things, hitting it up with, and during this part of your cycle, maybe you should be eating these kinds of foods. And and cervical mucus and temping and all of that, like you just get such a clear picture of what your body is doing. And that includes like, and why I'm feeling this way today, or why I have more or less energy today, why my workout was so good, why my husband looks really sexy right now, but he didn't last week, it's like all involved. And it really does center around that cycle. Our cycle has a lot to do with just our overall life, which I guess if you're talking about vital signs, right? Like that would make perfect sense that it's just all part of that. So it's beautiful. It's as women, it's like that is the thing that kind of we all have in common and all separates us and also brings us together. So I don't know. I just think it's so neat. I love that conversation completely. Okay, we talked about, just real quick, going back to like trying to conceive, and you talked about some different lengths of time that can be normal. I assume like when you're talking about condom as a use of contraception, once you take it away, that would be the same without a condom. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, in that study, they're showing that the female participant, in the equation didn't have any hormonal input. So there would have been no transition period to speak of.
Okay, perfect. I just want to clarify that. And then the other question that we got, and I know this comes up a lot, moms who are postpartum and breastfeeding, or not breastfeeding, but particularly breastfeeding, and they don't have their cycle back yet, but they're interested in conceiving. So there's a couple of questions there. Like women have asked, how do I get my cycle back? They've asked, do I need my cycle back? Like, is there any chance I could get pregnant? Am I still ovulating? Do things still happen there? And if I want it back, how long does that take? What do I have to do? Do I have to stop breastfeeding? So can you kind of touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, such a common question. Definitely, I get that question all the time. So, I mean, the way that it's typically presented to me, given the background in charting, is kind of like, do I need to wean in order to get my cycle back? That's, typically the scenario. And as you were talking about, I think the first step to make an informed decision, like you said, is that information. So I think first and foremost, it's helpful to know that initially, when you first had your baby, typically the most important and crucial factor that's going to determine how long it's going to take for your cycle to return is breastfeeding. And when you look at the research around that, it's the frequency and duration of suckling. So it's that prolonged contact that the baby has. And that's what's stimulating, the oxytocin release. And that's what's having the most profound impact on, in terms of suppressing that ovulatory function, while you're lactating. So that's something that I think is really helpful to know. So the first thing, I suppose, for a woman who's asking that question is kind of like, well, where are we at? How old is your baby? Because, if your baby's 2 months old, versus if your baby's 15 months old, these are two different conversations. So I think in the early stages, when your baby's still young, let's say under 6 months, then it's really, in terms of, when your period is going to come back, it's often related to your breastfeeding and certain things that change. For example, if you go back to work, if your baby starts eating solid foods, if your baby starts to sleep through the night, for some women, that might coincide with the return of their period, the return of their ovulation and menstruation kind of early on. And as you had alluded to as well, I do think there are just within women differences, and then there's kind of the absolutes, like we kind of talked about. So some women do tend to get their periods back sooner, regardless of if they're breastfeeding, and some women do tend to get their periods back later. I would love to see some research to explain that, similar to how I'd love to see research to explain the different gestational periods, because I think some women naturally have, longer versus shorter. So that's a little bit of background information. As a general guideline, I would say that when you are breastfeeding, if your period has not returned, and we're in like the 15-month mark, 15 to 18 months, even if you're breastfeeding significantly at that stage, by the time your baby is 12 to 15 months old or 15 months to 18 months, they're eating a lot more solid foods now. And even if they're drinking a lot of milk, it's not necessarily representing a big part of their nutritional value. So, given that I have a toddler right now, she loves I'm still breastfeeding. We're still there. But it's, by the time they get a little older, it's more comfort and, so that's something to take into consideration. So the first thing, I can't give a blanket answer because it really depends on where this woman is at, how old her child is and what's going on. One of the things, actually I was having a conversation with Lily, and it was interesting because we talk about similar things in, different ways. And one of the things, but there's so much overlap, which is why I wrote the book together. But one of the things I think we have to consider when women are asking this question. So let me just give a hypothetical. Let's say that we're not talking about someone whose baby is 4 months old or 6 months old. Let's say that we're talking about someone whose baby is, let's say like 8 months old to a year or something like that, where they're, it's perfectly reasonable for you to ovulate and start having a period again. It's not like it's so young and you're still breastfeeding. So one of the things that I have to say about it is that I feel like the question of like, should I wean? Before we have that conversation, I feel like we should look at the situation to determine if that's really the issue or if maybe there's something else. So for example, as someone who's had 3 babies, life changes a lot. There's like a running joke that 50% of my nutrition is coming from my toddler's leftovers. Like so before we start jumping into should you wean, I like to look at, we in our program, we call it the foundational factors, but I like to look at some of those things. Are you actually getting 3 meals a day? Like, are you getting sufficient protein? Have you really nourished your body after having a baby? Do we need to look at Lily's chapter 12 of Real Food for Pregnancy, the postpartum nutrition? Like, do we need to have that conversation? Like, are you getting any liver? Are you really getting sufficient protein and fat? So, and how much are you exercising? Because depending on the situation, obviously pregnancy comes with a lot of body changes, and depending on when you're going back to work and whose Instagram account you're following, you might feel some pressure, and it's harder to lose weight when you're breastfeeding because of the hormonal shifts. So there's a lot of things to dig into there. So I guess you can tell that what I'm saying is I don't think it's just this really straightforward, like, oh, just wean when you're ready. And because you might wean to discover that your period is still gone because it's not that. So I think it's a very personal decision. I don't think I could ever tell anybody what to do. I think I could just, because, there's also the emotional aspect of breastfeeding your child and things like that. So that's a really personal decision between you, your partner, your baby. You guys have a little powwow. But I would hate for you to wean and put yourself through potentially an emotionally difficult situation because you want to get your period back and for it to actually not be that. And then in terms of your, you had another question around, could I ovulate and like get pregnant before my cycle comes back? And the answer is yes. This is why in the 6-week appointment, your care provider is highly focused on getting you on birth control. So the thing is that when you understand how your body works, as we just talked about, before you get a true menstrual period, the ovulation comes first. So if you're actually tracking your cycle, we do teach postpartum charting in our programs. It is a thing that you can do. It is a bit different to regular charting because you mentioned, when you're charting, it's like you got your mucus and your temperature. But when you're postpartum, before your first ovulation, it's mucus or hormones, depending on the type of fertility awareness charting that you're doing. And so, if just from listening to this episode, if you happen to be in that stage, you can start paying attention, when you go to the bathroom, like look at your underwear, wipe, see if it feels slippery. And if you're aware of some of those factors, you can actually tell like when you're going to approach that first ovulation by the changes in your mucus pattern. And then if you also feel the need to, if you feel the desire, I should say, to take your temperature, you can also catch that first ovulation, if you were really on top of it. Or even just being aware of your body. And like you said, being aware that maybe you're more attracted to your partner at that time or they're more attracted to you. Some of the research indicates that they actually like the sound of your voice better when you're in your fertile window. Which is interesting being married because sometimes they don't seem to like our voice. But sometimes it's like they really want to talk to us. So maybe there's something to that. But either way, I think that it's really important to know that because I've also had many interesting conversations. I've certainly seen that happen, the pregnancy before the period comes back. And I've talked to women who say things like, we only had sex that one time. And it's like, yeah, but if there was one time you were going to do it.
Right. Yeah. I love that. Oh, that's so funny. Okay, side note here, and I don't even know if we need to necessarily include this in the episode, but have you seen the where they did, it was a study with men and women who were on birth control when they were dating versus not, and the issues that they had because of suppressing some of that stuff that him being attracted to her and her being attracted to him when they weren't necessarily. It was so interesting because it takes down it messes with the hormones and things, or it changes them. And anyway, so the things that make us attracted to certain people when we're on and off thing, even the smell, even our smell, how we smell when we have a regular set of hormones versus suppressing some of them. It was super interesting. I feel like I will look for that, and I'll see for those who are listening, if we keep this in the episode, I will link that below just because it's so interesting. But it makes total sense to me. I feel like I want to pay attention to that a little bit more now as you're talking. I'm because there are certainly times where my husband is all over me, and sometimes I recognize that oh, that's interesting because I'm totally ovulating. But now I'm really gonna keep track of it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I've seen the specific study that you've seen, but I've looked at a lot of studies. I had a section in the Fifth Vital Sign that went kind of into this stuff, and it is really, really fascinating. So, and they test it in different ways, and it's a whole for people who, because what happens sometimes, I feel a little less now because this is more well known, but when I was bringing this stuff up many years ago, I would get a little hate mail. I'd be like, "How could you say that?" Right? How could you suggest that a woman would not like the smell of their boyfriend when they come? But it's don't shoot the messenger. I'm just reading the study. So they do different studies where they do the T-shirt studies.
Yes.
So they have men wear these T-shirts for a couple days. And then they have women on the pill versus off the pill, smell the T-shirts and determine which they like better. So one of the controversial findings, I suppose you could say, is that women who are on the pill, they seem to pick partners whose genetic makeup is more similar to theirs.
Yes.
Compared to when
totally
they're when they're off the pill. So when you're in the wild naturally, it's you're going to choose a partner, and when they measure the degree of genetic similarity, you're choosing a partner who's more genetically diverse. And so this is that evolutionary biology. It's just so that you kind of understand why they're looking at this question. And so they're theorizing that in order for you to have, and this is super controversial, so don't shoot me, for you to have the healthiest kids, they're suggesting that the genetic diversity lends itself to stronger offspring and stuff. So it's super, this is why it's you can tell I'm doing all that, don't, but it's this is what they're saying. And they're saying that sometimes there have been, I included this woman told me this on my podcast, that she was on the pill and she started dating this guy, and then she came off the pill, and then he had this smell she never smelled before, and then she broke up with him. So, all I know is that when you look at the research, the pill so it's this magical idea that you could just take a pill and magically just not get pregnant and everything else in your body is the same. That's a lie. When we look at our menstrual cycles of vital sign, to go back to this point, then we can't look at it as separate. So I always give these silly analogies and like, so, if I wanted to buy, like it would be a dumb idea, but if I wanted to buy a car with no air conditioning, like that would be stupid. But if I did, I could, and the engine would still work and it would make no difference because it is a machine, right? But like with our bodies, we've kind of been sold this idea that you can just shut down your ability to get pregnant with this magical little pill and like it has no other effects. But if you just look at the side effect profile, then you have to ask yourself, like, if it really didn't have anything to do with it, why would the primary effect be depression and the libido? Like obviously it has all this and like when you get into the weeds with some of the other effects, like the increased risk of gallstones and like there's associations and correlations with immune disorders and even a higher risk of like IBS if you're susceptible to like like it's just unreal. So then from that perspective, we shouldn't be that surprised that there is this relationship between the pill and how we relate to other people. Like it's kind of messing with our natural pickers. And that's terrifying. Like it's really terrifying.
Well, and it makes me want to jump down another rabbit hole of like the fact that it's in our water. And then we can go even farther.
And the antidepressants and yes. Whatever else is in there.
Wait a second.
Yeah, that's a whole rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, I won't go there. We'll end it there. But thank you. Where can people connect with you, find you, get in touch with you, learn about your program, all of that stuff? Will you tell us all the socials, your website, all of that stuff before we jump off?
Yes, absolutely. And I got to say, thank you. This was a really fun conversation. I love the rabbit holes. It was a lot of fun.
Yes.
Well, yeah. So you can find me. You mentioned my podcast at the beginning of the show. So I've been podcasting for 10 years now, which is wild. So if you found this really interesting, we have over 500 episodes for you to dig into. Fertility Friday. Interestingly, I think there's another I think someone else took like the name, but I'm Fertility Friday Radio, and you'll see some pink because I'm a little. I don't know why, but I'm a little obsessed. So you'll see a little bit of pink and you'll know it's my podcast, Fertility Friday. The books, Real Food for Fertility, it was so much work, but Lily and I are really thrilled with the final product. And it's almost a year, it's 2 weeks actually until it's been a year from our initial release date. And we've been just really astounded by the testimonials, the stories. A lot of women have improved their cycles and improved their fertility. And there's a lot of babies now, Fertility Friday or Real Food for Fertility babies. So we're really excited about that. realfoodforfertility.com. You can get the first chapter for free. My first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, goes, way into the fertility awareness aspect. The Real Food for Fertility really does cover a lot of what we talked about today. And it's really geared towards the conception conversation. So we talk about the specific strategies for how to plan ahead, as we were talking about, and also how to optimize your chances of conception with timing and taking into account your partner's sperm qualities and parameters. So it's a really, really good and very, very thorough and deep conversation. There is like no other resource like it. So my website, fertilityfriday.com. And as you mentioned, I have a training program for practitioners where really this is a passion project where I envision a world where our practitioners are serving our women better so that we don't have to depend on that kind of late night desperate Googling to find out why we're feeling depressed on the pill or to really figure out how to stop that irregular bleeding that you're having. So for more information, you can find that on my website, fertilityfriday.com.
Awesome. For the practitioners that do go through you and have this knowledge now, do you have like a database for women that are looking for those kinds of practitioners as well?
I do. On the website, we have, like, if you look, we have a practitioner directory. So we've had practitioners from all over the world, which is super fun. A lot of our practitioners are in the States, some in Canada. We've had some in the UK. So we are steadily growing our practitioner list.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you for being here with me today. And yes, if you guys have not read the book yet, please go get it. I'll put a link for it below. And who knows, I might even do a giveaway for you guys because it is so good. I feel like it's 2 books in one because she really goes over the like solid nutrition stuff for fertility. And then you just hit hard everything that you need to know about cycles and sperm. You even go over like PCOS and some other things, which PCOS is like a huge deal right now. And I feel like continues to become a bigger bigger deal. So all that information is in there. But you are a wealth of information, and I just love everything you said today. So thank you for what you do and for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.